definitely the first, and I thought, well, maybe this might change as the group grew, the group of characters, but no, he very firmly held on to that narrative.
Let's talk about him. He's 11 years old at the beginning of the story, and he and his older brother are on the run. Talk about Francis, or French, or Frenchie, as he's known.
So Francis is Métis, and he's from my community. He's from the Georgian Bay Métis community, and he has very strong parents that give him culture, that take him on the hunt, that talk to him about the importance of preservation, of holding on to what it is that we have as a people and what they have as a family and what Francis has as an individual. And I think, putting him in this journey, it was a way for me to explore something that, although has a really strong history in Indigenous Canada, it's still unknown to me at a personal level because of the generation I'm in and because of, my own family circumstance. I was a bit removed. So I think having a character that was younger and a little more vulnerable allowed me to bring that immediacy to the narrative and to explore for myself what that might mean to be removed from family and be on the run.
So when you say your family circumstances were different, you haven't had to be, or no one has been removed from your family?
No. There was, in my grandmother's generation, there was adoption out into mainstream communities, particularly around Penetanguishene, but the community was close enough that the family found each other quite quickly, so we didn't have to deal with residential school.
You have chosen a very ingenious way of addressing the legacy of residential school. What made you decide to put the story through the lens of the future?
I wanted to talk about our stories and in particular what happens to communities through residential school. And this is where I think there's a light through the bleakness in this dystopia, is the fact that our community still exists. And so there was two things that I really wanted to play up by putting it in the future. One was that I wanted Indigenous youth to see themselves in the future. The dreams, of course, symbolize hope, and the hope that we've always had as Indigenous people, regardless of the struggle or maybe because of it. And so I wanted the youth in particular to see that hope and survival in a future context. And the second was, by placing residential schools in the future, I really wanted to put aside, even just for a little bit, for a moment, that sense of defensiveness or the tendency to shut down that can come with talking about a difficult history, like, for example, attempted genocide. So there's a real learning and personal or emotional involvement that can happen. I wanted people to come away saying, well, I would never let that happen, or I guess more correctly, I would never let that happen again.
In this case, the young people are literally running for the future. They're always on the run. What's causing them to run?
I tried to come up with an analogy for, basically we're always on the run, and this is something we know in the community. We are losing things that are precious to us, or we have the threat of loss that's constantly on our heels. In terms of language and culture and ceremony, these things were banned or outlawed or literally beaten out of us. And so there's a mad dash towards regaining, reclaiming, and holding on to what it is that we have. And so part of the idea of having the residential schools, I also wanted to show movement, that there was hope and there was a chance for this group, for all of us, to outrun it, to get past it. And so in the book I have recruiters from the schools that go out to try and gather together the Indigenous people to bring them to the institutions in order to remove the dreams. And that was important.
And this happens by harvesting their marrow.
Yes, yes.
Well, this story takes place in a future that has been devastated by extreme weather. What does that future actually look like, Cherie?
So this was something where I didn't realize I would have to figure out science for writing. So initially, in the original manuscript, I had this very arid sort of environment, and it was very dry, and the Great Plains were now the Great Deserts, and this was my idea. It was sort of I guess I had watched Mad Max, and that's what happened. But I went and did some research and looked at the NASA projections and really what the landscape would be. And the reality was even more terrifying than the sort of Mad Max dystopia I had come up with in my head. It was that, the oceans would rise, parts of the world would be submerged or crumble off, a huge part of the population would become homeless or would, we're talking about cities like New York and large parts of India would no longer exist. And it actually, it was quite terrifying, and things would be, quite erratic in terms of the change in the weather, and there would be a lot of rain, almost constant damp. And that actually made more sense in terms of the story, because what it then allowed me to do was to reimagine this great migration of people coming into different parts of the country. And we know by experience when the dominant society needs space, the first place that they go to are these so-called uninhabited traditional territories. And so it added another nuance and layer to that story, and bringing again that wave of newcomers.
One thing that really stood out for me, though, is that no one in this world that you've created, and the world, let's face it, that we are heading to, can survive on their own, that they have to have community. And there's a sort of made-up community in your book that